Hi everyone, welcome to Tales of Dread. So as I was preparing the Halloween specials, I noticed that I left out the aliens, so I decided to slide them in as a halftime special. Real or not, aliens and UFOs are sure out of this world. Now before we dive in, be sure to like and subscribe. Now let's go. There have been a lot of well-known UFO sightings in America. One of the most well-known ones happened in New Mexico in the summer of 1947. But the reported discovery of a downed alien spacecraft near Roswell was by no means the first such incident, with an equally mysterious crash having allegedly taken place in the neighboring state of Texas 50 years before. This week, we visit the mystery of Aurora. It was still dark outside when Charlie Stevens had been awoken by an insistent knock on his bedroom door, wiping the sleep from his eyes. The tired 10-year-old got out of bed, washed his face in the sink across from him, and then put on his overalls. He walked to the front door of the house in an unsteady way. His father was waiting for him with his hat ready for him to put on. When they got to the barn, they saddled up their horses and started the short ride to the farm's farthest pasture to round up the cows. As usual, father and son rode in silence, both keen to complete their daily morning routine before returning to the farmhouse and the hearty breakfast, which would be waiting for them, courtesy of Mrs. Stevens overhead. The deep, dark blue of the nighttime sky was now finally surrendering to a much lighter shade. When both of the horses unexpectedly began to fuss as Charlie gently kicked at the sides of his mount, trying to encourage it to move on, he could see up ahead that his father was experiencing similar difficulties. They both got off their horses, and we're now trying to get the horses to move forward. When they became aware of a mysterious humming sound which was gradually increasing in volume, unable to motivate his horse, Charlie gave up and instead walked over to his father, who stood looking about himself, trying to figure out where the strange noise was coming from. A dark shape seemed to appear out of nowhere in the sky above them. It was slowly coming down through the clouds and moving north toward the nearby town of Aurora. As the strange object passed directly over them and continued on its journey, Charlie found himself staring up at it in wonder. Except birds and kites, and that one time at the county fair when he saw a hot air balloon. The youngster had never seen anything else that could fly before. It was long and cylindrical, with a bright light situated at one end that seemed to be powering it as the airship began to move away. The humming also stopped, leaving the father and son to watch in stunned silence. When the flying object was no longer in sight, the horses seemed to calm down, allowing the farmers to continue on their way. But then they heard a distant rumble to the north, and the sky there suddenly lit up brightly. Charlie turned to his father and yelled that the flying object must have crashed, pleading to go investigate further, but his father refused. Such things were best left to the authorities, and besides, if they both rode off on a wild goose chase, who would round up their cattle? Charlie wouldn't find out what happened to the mysterious airship and its passenger until the next day, when his father rode into town. Most reports involving unidentified flying objects are often dismissed out of hand due to a lack of supporting evidence. Even when there is video or photo evidence, it is usually of such poor or unclear quality that it is almost useless. Since drones have become more common, hoaxes have become all too common. In the same way, when there are more than one witness to an event, there are usually not that many of them. Often the testimony of multiple witnesses is conflicting, which undermines their overall credibility. It is also common for alleged alien spacecraft to leave little or no physical evidence of their passing, which is why the events that took place in Aurora in April of 1897 stand out from the overwhelming majority of American UFO encounters. In the early hours of the 17th of that month, something fell out of the skies above the town. Something that was witnessed by multiple residents, resulting in the death of its pilot and leaving a trail of wreckage across the town. Perhaps one of the more surprising aspects of the Aurora incident is the pragmatic response by the town's inhabitants to the event. Whereas the Roswell incident 50 years later would generate paranoia and national hysteria to the solicitous people of this small Texan community, the crash was treated like any other tragic accident. The incident took place at roughly 6 am as the earliest risers of the town was slowly going about their business. All of the witnesses agreed that the flying object, which they called an airship, was first seen coming from the south toward the settlement. As it got closer to the town, it kept getting lower and making a strange sound that people thought was caused by a mechanical problem. As it got closer and closer to the ground, it finally hit the windmill that Judge Spencer Proctor owned in the town. The craft was probably going about 12 miles per hour, according to estimates. When it collided with the structure, it immediately exploded, showering the judge's property with flaming wreckage and causing significant damage. Rescuers attending the scene were initially held back by the fires, unable to sift through the devastation until the flames had eventually died down. When they did, they found the badly burned remains of one person and a lot of twisted metal that looked like a mixture of aluminium and silver. The accident was reported right away to the authorities in the nearby city of Fort Worth, who sent a signals officer named Weems to look into it. In his subsequent report on the incident, the military investigator stated that he believed that downed craft was not of an earthly origin. The body of the pilot was too disfigured to give any clue as to its origins, but Weems surmised that it was too small to be that of an adult, more comparable in size to that of a human child. He also couldn't decide what the strange markings and glyphs on the wreckage were. He said that he thought they were from another planet, but there was nothing else he could do to find out. The pilot's body was buried in the town cemetery, and a pastor from out of town led the Christian service. Smaller pieces of the wreckage were buried with it, while the bigger pieces were picked up and thrown down. Judge Proctor as well, which had been damaged along with the windmill. Somewhat amazingly, an article written in the Dallas Morning News, which directly asserted that the airship had come from another world, was met with little interest by the national press. Markers were erected at the crash site in the grave of the pilot commemorating the event, but it would be a further 80 years before there was any significant interest in the incident. In 1973, a local reporter named Jim Mars went to the town to try to find out what happened. He managed to locate what he believed to be the grave of the pilot and found a stone marker there with what appeared to be a saucer-shaped object depicted on it. He also noted that this marker looked to have been desecrated as it was broken into 2 pieces. Following on from the Mars article, Bill Case, a fellow journalist, began his own investigation. He was also the head of the local branch of MoviePhone and brought a metal detector with him to the site to see if he could locate the wreckage that had allegedly been buried along with the pilot. From the readings on his detector, Case concluded that there were at least 3 sizable pieces of wreckage buried within the confines of the grave. But when he applied for an exhumation order to remove the metal, this was refused by the church authorities. In the aftermath of this refusal, the MoviePhone investigator later found that the grave had been excavated by unknown persons with the marker removed and a length of metal pipe now buried under the ground. Now that this line of inquiry has been closed, the case began to look for witnesses. He was able to locate Charlie Stevens. Then, when he was in his late 80s, he told how he and his father saw the object moving north toward the town. A woman by the name of Mary Evans also came forward, who was 15 at the time of the crash and whose parents had seen the body and the wreckage the following year. Time magazine published an article debunking the crash in which they alleged that the entire affair had been fabricated by the author of the original newspaper story regarding the incident. A reporter by the name of Hayden, a local historian and longtime resident, was interviewed for this piece. Peggy's, the 86-year-old, told the magazine that in the years leading up to 1897, the town had suffered a catalogue of unfortunate mishaps. There was an outbreak of weevils which severely blighted the crops of the local farmers, followed by a widespread epidemic of fever and then a large fire which damaged several buildings. Peggy's claimed that when a nearby railroad, which was under construction, had been diverted to avoid Aurora, Hayden had conceived the story as a desperate attempt to keep the town relevant. She also said that Judge Proctor had never owned a windmill, and that the reporter had made that part of the story up as well. In November 2008, the judge's property, which had been bought from him by a man named Brawley Oates in 1935, was visited by a documentary called UFO Hunters. In interviews with his grandson, they learned that Oates had cleared the wreckage from the well, later claiming that the material had tainted the drinking water, afflicting him with an aggressive form of arthritis. Timothy Oates stated that as a result of this, his grandfather had blocked off the well with a concrete slab. He allowed the documentary makers to take samples of the water, which contained high levels of aluminium, and showed them the foundations of the windmill that had once stood on the site, seemingly undermining the testimony of Eta Peggy's. It would not be until the morning of December the 17th, 1935 years after the incident, that the Wright brothers successfully piloted a powered flying machine, and with the witnesses of the Aurora crash, adamant that the craft involved was not a hot air balloon. Is it possible that it really was a ship from another world? This question is difficult to answer with any certainty. It is true that at the time, efforts to create a powered airship were finally starting to achieve success across the world. Rich industrialists kept helping inventors get their planes to fly for short periods of time in certain places. Unfortunately, this often led to accidents and deaths. The manner of the crash certainly seems to suggest that the technology behind the unknown vessel was rudimentary in nature, with the craft traveling in a slow and sluggish manner, unable to correct whatever defect would doom it to its fiery demise. The area to the south of Fort Worth is particularly well suited for flying and would later be chosen by the military as the site of one of the country's first air bases. So is it possible that some unknown inventor was killed piloting an experimental airship of some kind, as opposed to an alien visitor? From 1896 onwards, people all over the world heard stories about strange airships whose passengers talked to confused onlookers. These things started happening in the western part of the United States, but they quickly spread to Europe and as far away as Australia and New Zealand. With the start of the First World War, these unknown zeppelins were often seen flying over rural areas and shining strange lights down. Their crews were sometimes seen making quick repairs on the ground, and witnesses said that these flyers often spoke in strange languages, wore strange clothes, and ran away quickly to avoid being caught or found. Many of these reports were attributed to the German Air Force, who was suspected of attempting to perfect the Zeppelins, which would pound and pummel targets across mainland Europe during the coming conflict. And yet, with the defeat of Germany, it became apparent that no such expeditions had been undertaken, and that the technology described by witnesses was still decades away from being created. The Royal Air Force had invested no time or interest in the pursuit. So who in the world could have done it? The Aurora airship crash remains a polarizing subject. Many residents there claim that the event was very real and left a lasting impact on the community. Others bemoan the unwanted attention that Hayden's newspaper article had brought the town, the result of a cynical attempt to obtain national interest and investment. Evidence to support the allegation remains frustratingly as divisive. Recent claims have suggested that Mr. Williams was in fact the town blacksmith, and not a signals officer at all. Others claim that in the aftermath of Roswell, the government made efforts to cover up the affair, fearing further public scrutiny on the subject. Whether you think the person who died in the fields of Aurora on that foggy April morning was an alien or an inventor of an airship, the evidence points to the fact that the event did happen. And whilst we may never fully know the whole truth behind it, we can take heart in the very compassionate and humane manner in which the people of the small Texan town responded to the tragedy. If English is the what of the universe, mathematics is the how, and science is the why, the who, where and when are spiritual questions, but no less relevant than the other three time. For some beer case in point, you don't ask the what, how wives beer. You simply ask the where, when, and possibly with whom. Alleged interactions with extraterrestrial craft and their occupants come in many forms, each providing varying degrees of evidence with which to validate their provenance. Only a small number of these cases have led to serious illness or injury, and there is no clear explanation for how or why the people involved got sick or hurt. This week, we examined two such instances of close encounters of the second kind. In 1972, famed ufologists J. Allen Hynek created a system that would put alleged extraterrestrial encounters into different groups. In recent decades, this system has been expanded to include every possible type of scenario, but at the time of its inception, there were only three classifications. The first type of encounter, which was the lowest level of the Hynek system, was defined as a distant sighting of what was thought to be an alien ship. On the other hand, the highest categories of third-kind encounters were decided by how people interacted with the people on these ships. But in between these two extremes lay a wide middle ground in which the craft identities involved left some form of physical evidence of their passing without directly interacting with any human being. These were classified as close encounters of the second kind. Examples of the evidence left behind at such incidents have included lasting damage being caused to vegetation and buildings, documented interference with electronics and other telecommunication systems, and in the most extreme cases, death or serious injury being inflicted upon humans or animals. These kinds of things don't happen very often, and we've already talked about some of the saddest ones in previous episodes. These incidents have also provoked a disturbing debate amongst commentators on the subject as to whether the harm caused to those involved is deliberate on the part of these visitors or merely an unfortunate byproduct of their presence. What is clear is that close proximity to alleged extraterrestrial craft and their occupants has proven time and time again to be extremely dangerous, with unseen and powerful forces exerted during these incidents. Forces which can lead to long-term injuries and lasting health implications for those who are lucky enough or perhaps unlucky enough to have witnessed such an event. It's about 9 o'clock at night. On the evening of the 29th of December 1980, drivers traveling along the Texas State Road 1485 would likely have seen an Oldsmobile Cutlass slowly laboring along the highway towards the city of Dayton. The car's owner, Betty Cash, had been returning home from a dinner with her longtime friend Vicki Landrum, along with Vicki's 7-year-old grandson Colby. The two women were in good spirits and were happily chatting away as the car proceeded to enter a heavily wooded section of the road. Shortly after this, Landrum told her friend that she could see a brightly lit object high above the trees moving through the woods in front of them. As Cash slowed down, she also saw it. After a short conversation, the two women agreed that what they had seen was probably an airplane trying to find Houston International Airport, which was close by. A little further along the highway, Cash suddenly became aware of an intense light up ahead which was illuminating the carriageway. "I thought it must be a truck coming up behind me with its lights still on full beam." She instinctively slowed down her own car, but then she saw that the light ahead didn't seem to be getting brighter or dimmer. As the car came to a stop around a blind turn, Cash could see that a large craft was hovering a few feet above the ground and partially blocking the road ahead. She would later go on to describe it as roughly the same size as the top of the water tower, being metallic in appearance and shaped like a diamond, with the tips cut off at the top and bottom. The central portion of this vessel was surrounded by a ring of blue lights, and every so often a series of intense flames would issue forth from the base of the object. When they did so, the craft would immediately coast forwards a few feet towards the car and then come to a halt until the next burst would then propel it forwards again. As she surveyed this mysterious floating object, Cash's first instinct was to turn the car around and drive back the way she came. But at the same time she was conscious that it had been raining heavily that day, and the ground either side of the road was muddy, leading her to fret that she may become stuck. It was at this point, during the incident, that Landrum commented about how hot she was feeling. Cash suddenly realized that the temperature inside the car seemed to have been steadily going up since the first time they saw the thing. Landrum, a long-standing and devout Christian, told her friend that she believed what they were witnessing was some form of religious visitation and stated that she wanted to get out of the vehicle. But as she went to do so, she stopped herself. Colby was getting visibly angry and upset in the back seats behind them, which they could see. Cash, on the other hand, did get out of the car and start walking slowly toward the mysterious floating craft. She was quickly stopped in her tracks by how hot it was, and she had to go back to the car. When she did so, she found that the door handle was now too hot to touch. When she got back into her car, she would have to wrap the sleeve of her coat around her hand in order to open the door. Cash then watched on in amazement as Landrum proceeded to place her outstretched palm on the vinyl of the dashboard. Now, the material was so hot that her hands seemed to sink into it. When she took them off, she left a permanent mark, which they are still looking at with complete confusion. The object gave off another huge flame burst and then slowly rose into the air until it was above the treetops. Then, the two women heard another noise as a group of big military helicopters flew quickly overhead. Interview after the interview, the strange ship took off, with army helicopters following it through the forest. The two women watched on for a time as the lights receded into the distance before carrying on with their journey, talking animatedly about what they had just witnessed. Later that evening, after she had dropped Vicky and Colby back home, Betty Cash suddenly collapsed in her kitchen and began to vomit. During the rest of that night, she kept getting violently sick and also got very sick and had diarrhea. The following morning, she made a phone call to Landrum, who immediately admitted that she too was experiencing similar symptoms as was Colby. Over the next few days, the condition of the two women would continue to steadily deteriorate. They both got weak and found it hard to pay attention to anything. Cash's skin started to blister in a painful way, like when you get a bad sunburn. When she finally went to the hospital to get checked out, doctors there noticed that small pieces of her hair were starting to fall out. A radiologist who looked at the patients said that their symptoms were similar to those of people who had been exposed to high levels of ionizing radiation, but in most of those cases, the people who had been exposed to high levels of radiation had died soon after. Instead, both women would get better, but they would have health problems for the rest of their lives. Betty Cash was taken to the hospital once a year for the next 18 years until she died. She had been diagnosed with breast cancer right after the alleged UFO sighting and had been fighting it for a long time. For her part, Vicky Landrum developed severe cataracts in both eyes, a condition that would impair her vision until her eventual death in 2007. Much like his grandmother, Colby was significantly less affected than Betty Cash, and he managed to escape the incident without developing any long-term health implications. In the years which have passed since the Cash Landrum sighting, there has been great speculation as to what could have caused the illnesses sustained by both witnesses. Some people think that in addition to low-level radiation, the women may have been exposed to something with an infrared property and possibly even an aerosol or gas. The most common theory is that Cash was more affected than her passengers because she temporarily gave up what little protection her car offered. This happened 30 years before the incident with Betty Cash and Vicky Landrum, and an even scarier event is said to have happened in a rural area not far from the outskirts of Buenos Aires. The primary witness of this incident would be a Venezuelan physician by the name of Enrique Bota, who before qualifying as a doctor had originally mastered a degree in engineering. It was his credentials in this field which had resulted in him being invited to Argentina during the summer of 1950 in order to work on a rural engineering project. One morning he was driving the rental car from his hotel along the remote highway towards the isolated rural area of Bahia Blanca where he had been working. Due to the early hour, there was no other traffic on the road, and so he had easily spotted what on approach appeared to be a car overturned in the field. But as Butter got closer to the crashed car, he saw that it didn't have any windows or doors that he could see. Instead, it looked like a flat piece of metal. After stopping a short distance away, he watched for a few minutes before getting out of his car to get a closer look. As he drove around the strange vehicle, he saw a hole in its side, which he used to get inside. It was difficult for him to see anything as there was only one blinking red light attached to the roof of the hole, but slowly as Butter's eyes adjusted to the dim interior, he realized that he was not alone. On one side, there was a large control panel of some kind with different gauges and meters that the engineer had never seen before. 3 metal seats with small figures strapped into them were set up around this strange console. The doctor said that the people inside the ship were about 4 feet tall and wore some kind of tight-fitting grey coveralls. He called out to the figures, but they didn't answer. He moved closer to try to wake them up. Voter would later recall that. As he shuffled around towards the chairs, he ran his hand along the interior of the disc and was amazed to find that it had the texture of rubber, despite being apparently metallic in appearance. Then he shook the shoulder of one of the beings who was sitting down. The skin beneath his fingers felt solid, and almost charred in texture. At this point, Butter ran away from the object because he thought the people inside had died in the apparent crash. He drove straight back to the hotel and told Horatio and Leo what he had seen. "Thank you." The 3 men got their guns ready and drove back to the place where the machine had been. Instead of the machine, they found a mysterious pile of dark ash. When one of the men picked up some of this ash in his hand, the skin on his hand slowly turned purple and stayed that way for the next 3 days. As the men began to spread out and walk around the vicinity of the ash pile, they suddenly caught sight of a series of strange red lights approaching in the distant sky. Losing their nerve, the men ran back to their car and made off as fast as they could, taking a couple of blurry photos of the flying lights as they did so. Just as with the Cash Landrum sighting in the days following the event, Enrique Butter's skin began to severely blister on his face. The imprint of where he had been wearing his sunglasses on the day of the incident remained seared into the skin, and did not fade away for many weeks when he was subsequently bedridden with severe fever-like symptoms which had gone on to overwhelm him. Boter was finally rushed to hospital. Doctors carried out a battery of tests on him, concerned that he had succumbed to a form of radiation poisoning. And yet, there was no sign of this at all. During the testing, which lasted for a few years, neither of the 3 men allowed themselves to speak about the incident until Butter was finally persuaded to attend a UFO conference where he opened up about the experience there to fellow delegates. This would lead him to commit his memories of what had happened to paper in a book he titled Situation Red. Concerning other similarities between these 2 events and the life-threatening symptoms that showed up in the people involved. These symptoms are also found in many of the stories of people who say they have been visited by aliens. This radiation-like poisoning could be a side effect of a scanning device that the alien ship is using, or it could be a byproduct of the ship's propulsion system or fuel source. Another idea is that the atmosphere where the entities usually live is harmful to humans, so they have to make it the same in their craft and in the area around them. Then it ends up being dangerous for the witnesses they meet. Thankfully, most alleged UFO sightings are still close encounters of the first kind, but since there are so many UFO stories in the news right now, it's always possible that these visitors will decide to make direct contact with humans one day. Perhaps such cases should be taken as cautionary tales. I haven't told anyone this before, but I'm going to now. In the 1980s, I would take the Amtrak from Houston to San Antonio once a week to see my boyfriend. According to the schedule, it left around 7 at night, and got to the San Antonio station around midnight. But you should know that Amtrak never shows up on time. In fact, Sometimes we have to wait in Houston for the train for an hour or more. Sometimes we get on the train, but somewhere along the way, we have to get off because a freight train is going by or something. Sometimes I don't even know what's going on because they don't always tell the passengers. Also, when it's nighttime, they usually turn off the lights in the train so people can sleep and relax, but I never sleep. Since it's dark inside, I want to know what's going on. Most often, you can see out. I like to look at the small towns as they go by. Out the window, you never know what you'll see. Usually nothing but the backs of buildings, abandoned houses, or whatever. But every once in a while, I'll see something interesting, like looking into someone's window and getting a glimpse of their life. I don't remember what time it was, but it was dark, and we stopped in the middle of nowhere. Who can say? The track was probably being used by a freight train, and while we were waiting, I looked out the window and saw a big warehouse with a few lights on. It had a rusty chain link fence around it with a gate in it. The warehouse was made of corrugated steel, and weeds and vines grew all the way up to the top, making it look like the roof was caving in. I thought no one was using it anymore. But then I wondered why the lights were on. Someone had to pay that electric bill for those lights to stay on. So I kept looking at it because I thought it was interesting and I wondered if anything was going on inside or if they just kept the lights on for safety. I stood there and didn't do anything. I don't know why I looked any longer. The train started moving again after a while, and just as it did, I saw a car pull up to the gate. It was dark, so it was hard to tell, but I think it was a black car. The train then left before I could even see if it went through the gate. I forgot about that warehouse until we got stuck in the same place again a few weeks later. I guess there must be something else there. This time, 4 or 5 cars were parked close to the warehouse. We stopped when, as usual, it was dark and hard to see everything, and the lights outside the warehouse didn't really light up the cars. I think people got out of their cars and went into the building. This time, it looked like the big door was open. Not all the way, but there was a crack that looked like it could let a person in. After a while, I think I got close to it, but it wasn't easy to see because of all the shadows. I wish I could have seen the people better, but it looked like some of them were wearing suits and others were wearing jumpsuits or the kind of clothes that mechanics wear. They were carrying small things in their hands, and I think they had some kind of tool to make those things. Now I was really interested, but of course the train left before anyone came back out of the building. But by this time, I was really into it, so I decided to start bringing my binoculars with me on my next few rides. I was ready with my binoculars in case the train got stuck there again, but just my luck, it didn't. We didn't stop there for weeks, and I thought they might have figured it out. I thought maybe the people in the cars knew we could see them and that we might be able to see what they were doing. But then it happened again after about 5 weeks. When the train finally stopped there, I could see at least 5 cars in front of the warehouse. A few of the cars both in front and behind had their headlights on. I quickly brought my binoculars up to my eyes and could finally see clearly. I could see that the warehouse door was open, and I watched as people got out of their cars in front. But I don't think they were all people, at least not all of them. Between 2 of the black suits, there was a short, grey figure with a big head that looked like it wasn't wearing anything. I don't think it was a small person, but it could have been. Its body was small, but its head was huge. So if it was a person, it must have been deformed or changed in some way, and the way they were pulling it by its feet made it look like it was dead, passed out, or sick. I watched as they dragged it into the warehouse and then followed it with 2 of the jumpsuits. They were doing one of the best things together when all of a sudden, the headlights went out and the warehouse lights came back on. After that, I don't think anyone else went in, but it was hard to tell. There were shadows and movement, but there was nothing near the door. Then I turned my binoculars back toward the door and watched as it closed. I wish I had been able to stay and see if anyone else came out. But when the train started moving, I didn't forget anything. I couldn't get that warehouse out of my mind. I was very curious about what was going on there. On a map, I tried to find the intersection. I even went to AAA. I tried to find where I could get one, but I couldn't find it. I didn't know where it was, and there didn't seem to be any factories near where I thought it should be. I even looked at the train route to see if the train might have been on a side rail when it stopped. Even after looking at a lot of freight rail maps, I couldn't find a solution. I looked. The place didn't seem to be there. As far as I could tell, it wasn't even close to a town. I decided that the only thing I could do was wait to find out more. We didn't stop there again for a few weeks, and when we did, I wasn't even sure it was the same place. Only because I remembered a tree with a big knot in it did I know it had to be one that was usually right by my window or at least a few feet away. The tree was still there, but now there was a wall behind it. It was one of those concrete walls that were used to block noise along the highway, and it was close to the track. And what was even scarier, was that it looked like it had always been there. I tried to see how far it went, but as far as I could see, it just kept going. I kept wondering if this was the same place. It didn't seem possible. But that tree seemed to be the same. So, we went back to that spot many times over the next few months. It was the same every time. I could only see that wall. There was nothing else. My boyfriend and I broke up in the end, and I've never been able to figure out why. I used to talk a lot about strange things that happened to me. When I was younger, I was so naive that I thought some people would believe me. Most of the time, though, they didn't. Instead, they made up excuses like it was dark outside, I was wrong or tired, etc. I decided to stop talking about it. But when I heard your show, I knew I had to tell you and your listeners about this. I'm from the top of the Mitten, which is the lower peninsula of Michigan. If you understand what I mean. If you are from Detroit, you would say it is up north. There isn't much up here besides lakes and trees, but it's still pretty. And in the summer, there are a lot of tourists. It's cold in the winter. Everyone but the people who live there leave, and there aren't that many of us left. So, like most teenagers in rural areas at the time, we would go into the woods to have a bonfire. During one of these fires, something bad had happened. This was before cell phones really took off, at least up here. So when we were at the party, we couldn't talk to anyone else. Our usual place was this farmer's field that was surrounded by woods on all sides. After the farmer brought in the last harvest, the older kids told us to wait until late fall or early winter to start going there. So we knew nobody would be up there. When you were a sophomore or junior in my town, one of the seniors would let you tag along to one of their parties and show you where to go. Nobody went crazy at these events because it was too cold and we heard too many stories of kids getting lost in the snow or losing fingers to frostbite. But we always had a good time. Most people don't listen to what I say, so I'm telling you this. I was a young, scared teenager, but I wasn't crazy when it happened my sophomore year. We were having a bonfire in the field, and everything was fine. Everyone was enjoying themselves. We were burning parts of an old barn and some furniture that an old lady had left out for trash. At the time, my best friend, who I'll call Mike to protect his privacy, was grilling frozen burger patties next to me on an old, rusty charcoal grill. We stayed out there, and Sarah, whose real name we don't know, stood with us and talked like she always did. When we heard this low, rumbling growl, I looked in the direction of the sound and saw two eyes shining back at me from the edge of the firelight. I pushed Mike and Sarah and slowly pointed in the direction of the eyes, trying not to startle whatever was watching. About 10 yards separated us from the closest group of partygoers. Sarah was scared, so she slowly walked back toward them. She never looked away from the edge of the light from the fire. She didn't even look like she was breathing. I had the exact opposite reaction as she walked away. I was fascinated by her glowing eyes in the dark. In Wisconsin, we had heard for a few years that gray wolves were coming back from Canada to the lower peninsula, but all anyone had seen were flashes on trail cameras or tracks in the snow. Even the Fish and Game Commission couldn't decide if these were real signs of wolves or if people were just confusing dogs and coyotes. I was excited to think that I might be the first person in Lower Michigan to see a real wolf. Mike was excited, too, because he stuck close to me as I slowly moved closer to get a better look. Walking up to a possible wolf is pretty much the dumbest thing you could do. But I was young, and I could hear Sarah telling the rest of the group to keep an eye on what was going on behind me. I couldn't give up at this point. Everyone was watching, and I was a newbie. Mike and I were about 7 yards away from the supposed wolf at this point, and I could just barely make out the shape of its ears and head. It almost looked like a big German shepherd, but its nose and ears were bigger. The growling got deeper and scarier, as if it were no longer a warning but a real threat. I've heard a million dogs growl, but this one sounded more raspy and guttural, like the creature's vocal cords and chest were out of sync or that it had stopped moving and turned back. I was scared and wanted to go back, but I wanted to be the big man at the party. I wanted the older kids at the bonfire to tell the story of how this new kid became a local legend the next year. I smelled a strong smell coming from the wolf when they talked about the bonfire. It smelled like a dog that had been swimming in urine. I was maybe 5 yards away at this point, and I knew I couldn't get any closer. Also, I could now see that something was wrong. I could now see the whole shape of the creature, and it wasn't a wolf. The head and legs looked like they belonged to a large German shepherd, but the torso was human-like. It had broad, muscular shoulders and a large hump of dense muscle on its back. I fell backwards. I don't know if my foot hit a rock, a stick, or something else, but it made a noise that scared the animal. Then it stood on its back legs and growled. I'm 5'10". This thing was staring right at me. Its breath was hot and smelled awful. I fell backwards and landed on my bottom. In that position, I scrambled away as fast as I could. I tried very hard to get back to the fire as I threw handfuls of dirt and rocks at the creature. The animal ran into the woods while making this whooping, howling sound. Over the years, everyone at the party did nothing but stare at me in silence. The whole thing turned into a joke about a kid getting scared by a coyote or the farmer's dog. I've even heard that it was a raccoon that was very big for its kind. I don't blame people. If I hadn't seen it myself, I might think the same thing. Mike was the only one who was close enough to really see anything, but he won't talk about it. Every time I bring it up, he changes the subject. So I stopped bringing it up with him. Sometimes I wonder if something bad would have happened if we hadn't seen those eyes at the edge of the firelight. If someone left the party to go to the bathroom or kiss in the bushes, that could be a reason. Instead of a local joke, this could have been an unsolved murder. In any case, I guess I'm just happy that everyone is okay. I grew up on a farm in Vermont, which is in the northeast of the United States. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, so it was very remote. I knew farm work was hard because I watched my parents do it, but there were so many good things about growing up in a rural area. My older sister and I would bring snacks and a blanket outside at night to look for shooting stars. It was one of my favorite things to do. Every shooting star we saw gave us each 1 point. She was 5 years older than me, so I could never spot them as well as she did. She would try to show me where they were, but they would often be gone before I could find them on a normal night. My sister pointed up and said, "There it is." I saw it right away, and as it arced across the sky, I couldn't believe how long we could follow it. Then, out of nowhere, 3 more shooting stars shot straight toward it. But then they seemed to stop in the air, and all 4 lights changed directions at the same time and began moving together toward the south. My sister and I watched this with wide eyes, and we craned our necks to follow the lights as they moved across the sky. We looked at each other for a second or so after they were gone, and then Laura said, "I think we just saw UFOs." I was 8 years old. So I was really scared. As we got our things together and walked through the dark back to our house, I didn't say a word. We didn't tell our parents or brother what we saw because we were both confused and hoping to find a less scary explanation for the strange lights. The next day, everyone in the family got in the truck and went shopping in town. To my surprise, people at the grocery store were talking about the strange lights. When someone asked my mom if she'd seen them, she said she hadn't, but she did say that Laura and I had been looking at the stars the night before. She then asked us if we had seen any lights in the sky, and we both said no. We didn't want to answer any questions about what we had seen, and it turned out that was the right choice. There were a few articles in the paper about the lights, and people who said they were UFOs were laughed at by the rest of the town. The local radio station's morning DJs even wrote a song about the nuts. The official story was that people who saw what they thought were UFOs turned out to be military planes practicing maneuvers. We saw the lights a long time ago, but Laura brought up that night a few years ago after we had both had a few drinks. She told me that over the years that followed, she had come to believe that what we had seen were jets flying in the sky. She didn't think they were UFOs anymore. She told me about it all those years ago, and I argued with her a little bit about it, asking how she could do that to me. Because I still thought what she said to me in the end. We agreed to disagree. But to be honest, I think that even though she thinks she has talked herself out of the truth, we both know that those lights were not from this world.